Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange find it necessary to file their own lawsuit against the U.S. chemical corporations, which gained enormous profits from the sufferings of millions of people.
I represent Vietnamese nationals who are suffering from the effects of Agent Orange, or herbicides that were sprayed during the war in Vietnam. We're suing the chemical companies because these companies not only provided the Agent Orange, they had the knowledge beforehand that it was toxic.
I don't think I probably ought to get on television, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm happy to talk to you on background. I already talked at length to the Reuters reporter. But...
And with television, unfortunately, we can't take our camera inside. One very quick summarization of the defense.
It's way too complicated. There are a number of different defenses, so there are a lot of different reasons why this case can't go forward.
I remember when this was going on in the early 80s. Same judge, same court, and now we're back trying to make the circle full because we've been able to get American veterans, at least under some conditions, to be recognized. And now it's time to get the Vietnamese victims given some kind of justice as well.
I initially went to Vietnam to interview some prospective plaintiffs. Quy is someone who is suffering from cancer. He also had children who have diminished intelligence and developmental problems. Dr. Fifi is a very intelligent, educated, and articulate person. One of the roles of a plaintiff in a class action suit is that they represent the interests of other plaintiffs. You've got to be able to speak in court and to lawyers and to media.
I attended the hearing along with Dr. Fifi from Vietnam. We embargoed Vietnam up until 10 years ago, so it would not have been possible for them to file suit. They could not have hired U.S. lawyers. Dr. Fifi was the only member of the plaintiffs who attended the hearings, and she had to face a room full of lawyers from the Dow Chemical Companies, Monsanto, Hercules. I would say probably 30 lawyers and their legal assistants in their black suits against this one Vietnamese woman.
Tôi là nội khoa, nhưng mà cũng như tất cả các bác sĩ của chúng tôi, những bác sĩ mà tương đối đã lâu năm á, thì phải biết làm một số phẫu thuật cấp cứu thông thường, rồi phải biết đỡ đẻ. Riêng cá nhân tôi thì lúc đầu tôi cũng không biết, nhưng đến khi mà cuối năm 71 cho đến năm 72, 73, đầu năm 73, từ khoảng đấy thì tôi có thai 4 lần và liên tiếp là tôi sảy. Trong 2 năm 4 lần sảy. 4 lần sảy. Thực ra nếu như cá nhân tôi chẳng kiện, bởi vì tôi không muốn nhắc là quá khứ chiến tranh. Đó là một cái quá khứ rất là đau khổ, phải nói, cá nhân tôi. Nhưng mà vì tôi thấy nạn nhân da cam, vì tôi làm nghiên cứu về cái vấn đề này, sau khi tôi hiểu rằng nó có liên quan nào đó, thì tôi bắt đầu nghiên cứu nó rộng hơn cùng các đồng nghiệp của mình, làm nhiều mặt tác hại lâu dài của. Tôi thì nghỉ hưu rồi, vì đã 70 tuổi rồi. Nhưng mà đứng về mặt trường á, thì tôi vẫn làm cố vấn cho cái dự án nghiên cứu về dioxin của trường, National Project. This is deep freezer for keeping the sample on the sampler. Salt and some fish or blood, or fish or blood. You see the blood. We send abroad to Germany, to Canada, to United States for dioxin analysis. So, they extract the genetic material from the blood, from the tissue to take the DNA, the genetic materials. Yeah.
Như vậy là từ năm 71 mà cho đến năm 77 thì bắt đầu ra quân, tháng 7 năm 77 thì ra quân. Không, lúc bây giờ chúng tôi vào thì nó đã dài rồi. Tức là mình chỉ thấy cây nó, những cái cây to là nó chết. Nên lúc bây giờ các cái cây bé nó đã bắt đầu mọc lên. Vâng, cái cây bé nó mọc lên, cây to là nó chết. Đấy, nó còn lại cái xác cây thôi. Đúng rồi, rồi trước đây thì nó giải chất độc, người ta có nói, đơn vị nó có giới thiệu là trước đây là cái vùng này bị giải chất độc hóa học cho nên cây cối nó chết như vậy.
Tôi đã đến thăm, hồ sơ của ông tôi giữ, hiện giờ cái bản photocopy tôi giữ. Kể cả những giấy ông vay nợ mà để ông mua thuốc tôi cũng giữ, tôi đều có bản photocopy. Quý thì ông bị ung thư. Đầu tiên là ung thư dạ dày, nhưng mà sau nó di căn lên cả phổi. Rồi thì chữa bệnh, chữa bằng hóa chất.
Còn vàng mã
4.416.
Các số tê, thuốc rất là đắt. Tay tôi có những cái photo của cái dây nợ của ông mượn là đến độ 20.000 đô rồi để trị liệu. Năm ngoái tôi đến thăm thì tôi thu những cái giấy ấy, photo mà tất cả đều là vay nợ hết. Cái bà con rồi hợp tác xã rồi quê của anh người ta.
Nó yếu, không làm gì được. Ở nhà giúp cho bà gói năm hương, năm hoa nhẹ nhẹ thì thôi, giặt giũ cho con cái. Rồi là trông nom nó xúc cơm cho nó ăn. Chứ có đi lao động gì được đâu.
Sinh hoạt của con cơ quan của đoàn thể cũng đã có phổ biến về chất độc hóa học màu da cam của Mỹ có thể là rải xuống Việt Nam, nhưng mà chưa biết là tọa độ ở đâu, chưa biết ở vùng nào. Thành ra một buổi chiều đó thì khi một đoàn trực thăng nó bay ngang rất là nhanh, thấp nhanh, một vệt sương mù làm như sương mù màu trắng đục như sương mù chạy dài theo con suối. Giờ con suối mà chúng tôi đang làm việc, tôi đang làm việc, đang công tác. Rồi tiếp đến là bị hoại tử lách, nó gọi là nhiễm vi sinh gì đó của lách, thành ra đã giải phẫu cắt bỏ rồi.
Who should be held accountable? The US government or the chemical companies?
Theo tôi thì các cái công ty hóa chất của Mỹ, họ đã sản xuất ra cái sản phẩm này, họ phải có trách nhiệm với cái sản phẩm của họ, vì họ đã kiếm lãi ở trên cái sản phẩm này.
Tôi nói thẳng là cái vô nhân đạo nhé, chết người mà chết cả, coi như cái chiến tranh thầm lặng mà gây cho cái đau thương mất mát cả suốt cuộc đời người, mấy chục năm sau, đời con đời cháu nữa. Mà cái này là cái vô nhân đạo nhất.
Mà đem về sáng á là gây lên chỗ đau khổ cho người Việt Nam thì chứ đề nghị với chính phủ Mỹ xem là cho cái cảnh là đau khổ của người Việt Nam.
Did the government know about the effects of dioxin?
Some evidence we have that some government scientists that knew about the effects of dioxin and didn't care is a letter from James Clary, who was one of the scientists that designed the spray tanks that were used in Vietnam on those C-130 airplanes that sprayed the herbicide. He wrote a letter to Senator Tom Daschle.
When we, military scientists, initiated the herbicide program in the 1960s, we were aware of the potential for damage due to dioxin contamination in the herbicide. However, because the material was to be used on the enemy, none of us were overly concerned.
And we didn't care because they were Vietnamese and not Americans. That's really what you can read into that statement, and that's what we've relied upon in our papers, that there was really an element here of racism. That's something that we've cited in our case. in support of the fact that this was a crime against humanity.
The chemical companies, as well as the U.S. Department of Justice, refused our request for interviews.
Obviously, you can't sue the government. As an entity, the government has got sovereign immunity. So it would have kind of been a waste of effort to sue the government. The case would have been dismissed automatically anyway.
If the government was complicit in this, then the government was guilty of spreading unknown toxins on civilian populations. One has to believe that the government was not aware of that. But we know from the documentary evidence that the companies supplying Agent Orange were well aware of the dioxin contamination and of the risk it posed.
In 1984, 3 chemical companies tried unsuccessfully to sue the government to recover the settlement they had paid to the veterans. The government produced evidence that officials of all 3 companies had secretly discussed among themselves the dangers of Agent Orange in 1965, but failed to share that information with the military.
A civilian company that supplies chemicals to the government can be held responsible for its acts under international criminal law if it knew what use was being made of its poison that it was supplying.
They told the government certain things. Remember, all that was known at the time was that dioxin, and Agent Orange is not dioxin. Dioxin is a trace contaminant in Agent Orange. In Dow's Agent Orange, it was less than 1 part per million of dioxin.
The companies knew that in producing so much of this, in producing and supplying to the government over 20 million gallons of this stuff, that at some point, what initially might have been thought of as trace levels of dioxin would now become poison.
The dioxin levels in the 2,4,5-T that went into Agent Orange could have been controlled, but it would have increased the cost. You would have to clean up the material afterwards to remove byproducts, so it would have been more expensive, and therefore less profit. Many of the companies that made the components of Agent Orange, their hygienic procedures were, shall we say, questionable.
Now, when the Vietnam War started, that's when Monsanto built a brand new building called 92. And that's when they were really running a lot of 2,4,5-T out. Ran the clock, full shift all the time. When the war was over with, Building 92 was tore down completely to the ground. There was nothing. They covered it with gravel and then blacktopped it. Cut it up, chopped it up, buried it in the ground. Yeah, it sure did. I've seen them. I know it's buried there. The ground's polluted. There's no way out of it.
The dioxin remains for perhaps hundreds of years in soil and sediment and then can contaminate the food. Even today, people have elevated levels of dioxin in their blood or nursing mothers in their breast milk, and they're getting it through eating contaminated food, animal fats from meat, from dairy product, from fish. And the levels, surprisingly, in people now, and even in soil and food, are very high. The level of dioxin is as high now as it was in the times of spraying.
Should the American chemical companies pay compensation to a former enemy? soldiers and civilians alike?
If you believe in the American form of civil justice, where a wrong has been committed and a person has been injured, compensation is required by our law. So the idea that Vietnamese children may come to this country to seek compensation from wrongful conduct of American corporations seems entirely consistent with our system of justice.
Clearly, this was an insurgent war where the enemy, the National Liberation Front soldiers, lived amongst peasants and civilians. So if you're destroying the food supply for one, you're destroying it for all. The chemical companies disregarded that risk. They were making it as fast as they could, as cheaply as they could, because they were asked to do so by the government. They engaged in chemical warfare, and that's at the heart of our argument. World War I was the first war in which chemical weapons were used, and that's the war that resulted in the real effective ban on chemical weapons.
If the definition of a chemical weapon is a chemical used in warfare for the purpose of harming a person, then the herbicides were not used for the purpose of harming a person. However, if you define chemical weapons more broadly, as some have attempted to do, it's a chemical used in warfare, so therefore it's a chemical weapon. But this is all for the lawyers of armed conflict to sort out. Humans do ugly things to each other, but nonetheless, we do like to draw limits and say, this is okay, regrettable but okay, and this is outside the bounds of civilized behavior.
This is, by the way, the kind of claim that is normally settled by state-to-state diplomatic negotiations and not by lawsuits. So we think it's up to the United States government to decide whether what it did was wrongful and whether it should pay restitution. And the first step, which has not been established, is to show that, in fact, Agent Orange actually injured people.
To this day, Vietnam veterans continue to get sick, even after the settlement fund expired in 1994. Attorney Gerson Smoger filed a suit on behalf of two of them. Joe Isaacson is a New Jersey veteran.
I was stationed in Vietnam in '68, '69 on a base called Van Rang. I was a crew chief on the F-100.
When Joe Isaacson got cancer in 1996, there was no money left.
I did have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was a direct, at that time was believed as a direct result of the Agent Orange, the dioxin.
Joe Isaacson is one of many veterans who have filed suit against the chemical companies since the settlement fund expired. Their combined cases will be argued on the same day in the same court as the Vietnamese class action lawsuit. While the American court was considering the Vietnamese lawsuit, scientists from Europe, Vietnam, and the United States gathered in Paris. Their goal was to share the latest research on dioxin, as questions still lingered about the causes of birth defects.
Fifi, how are you?
Thank you.
Good to see you.
When did you arrive? Yesterday or?
Yesterday.
Former Vice President of Vietnam, Nguyen Thi Binh, led her country's delegation.
This study showed a statistically valid increased incidence of unfortunate outcomes of pregnancy, i.e.
Dr. John Constable was among